Welcome to Kümneger Talks. I'm your host, Selam Abebe. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of today's podcast titled Holding Up the Other Half of the Sky, Habesha Fathers and Their Children. Let's jump right in.
ብዙ አይነት ከለር አለ
ግን I think አንተ የምታወራው ምንድን ነው? There's a difference between how you're perceived by everybody else in the world, right? Like,
Yes.
no matter what you think, if you think you're not black, like based on what you said and the definition that you've given, yes. But by the same extent, that doesn't matter because you lived your lived reality with everybody around you perceiving that you are black, right? ማንም ሰው መተክ መጀመሪያ ጥቁርና ማንም ሰው ጊዜ የለው መታ አውርቶ ምናምን ሁሉ ለማወቅ ነገር nobody has time for that. These are just classifications that they give to you. So I understand, and that's the one thing that I like too is my dad, where I delineate between how my dad sees things and when I see things is I do recognize that my lived experience in Canada is I'm perceived as a black guy. Different things depend on how my hair looks like, but most of it, that's the case. However,
are you sure it's not Arab?
I get that too. So if I get a mix, I can look Indian, I could look Mexican, I could look Habesha, depending on how. But my point is there's that element of it. I can't run away from it, right? How people perceive me does impact it. But what I liked about how my dad raised me in that sense was there's that element of like, I'm not letting that define me to some extent, because I find that the impact of being told that over and over again, because I do agree with my dad's definition of it. Most times when people say it, there's the element of, okay, there's black culture, you're black in that sense, and there's the underlying like implicitness of it that nobody really talks about, which is that. And yeah, I'm not that. And growing up, if I was ever told that repeatedly over and over and over again, I always use this example. My dad, there's these birds stuck on the roof of the apartment one time, and they were trapped in this cage. And then the birds kept on trying to get out the whole time. But then after a while, the birds stopped trying to the point where my dad lifted the cage, the bird didn't fly off, right? So there's that element of it too, when you grow up in cultures where you're ingrained and you're told something over and over again, it does inhibit you. So I do also understand why a lot of Habeshas say like, no, I'm not black, because they're saying, yeah, all the associations aren't there. And at times I don't say it anymore. I have said it when I was younger. I'm saying that I'm not letting that like box my opportunity into some extent, because a lot of people get into this stage where, okay, I say this with Habesha community in general, where you've been here for 10 plus years, right? At a certain point, yeah, society has a lot and has imposed things on you, but once you get ingrained in this mentality that is gonna happen, it ends up boxing in your opportunity. And when something good does happen, you can't even notice it. Like the bird who gets the cage lift off of it, it's trapped in thinking that there's that. So I think there's a little bit of those where, yes, people do see me as the bird that's trapped in the cage, but at the same time, I don't want to, the reason why my dad tends to separate those two is he doesn't want to identify, because if he is the bird in the cage, when the bird cage gets lifted off, he could fly. Whereas if he's associating with it, for him, it's like, no, I'm trapped. Yeah.
I have, from what Mane was saying, my brother-in-law is West African. I used to go to Ghanaian church, basically Ghanaian, but mainly African. Maybe we have in the church there were only less than 10 Caucasian or any other color for that matter. So when I see the Ethiopian side, I see we are shy of our being black.
I think
and also
that's true across cultures though, Papa. I don't necessarily think of it as like something that's specific to Habeshas. Like I know like Asians too, like I think it's just that whiteness has just been put as a sort of standard, and I don't think I just don't think it's like unique to Habeshas, this quality.
Okay, well, yes and no. You could say that, but at the same time, if I go to an Ethiopian and say, where do you go to church? He will say, to the black church. They're black. And if you go to in Ethiopia, and if I ask, if someone talk about my sister, he will say, "Oh, she's been married to a black guy." She will not say. Nobody will say she's married to an African, or no mention the country. They will say black. Who am I? Am I black or no? So that conflict is there. That will, that makes it very hard for us to assimilate, even with an African context. Within African context, it's very hard.
I agree. I think that especially even though what you're saying, Ita, about different, even Asians do it. I think it's pretty unique with Africans and just Black people, because Africans aren't represented. I don't think there are a lot of people who still think that Africa's a continent or a country and not a continent, So I think that what you're saying, they'll say Black first because they might not even know the country. I think that
just as an African and talking about a country within Africa, okay, የራሳችን ፕራይድ ስላለን፣ ሁለተኛ ደግሞ የራሳችን ከልቸር ኮሎናይዝድ አልነበርንም ምን ብለን የምንጠራው ከልቸር moral values እነዚህ ስላሉ we isolate ourselves። ፍርሃት አለን diluted እንዳንሆን፣ በሌላው እንዳንዋጥ፣ ያ ከልቸር እንዳይውጠን ፍርሃት ስላለን የራሳችንን ክብ ሰርተን እንቀመጣለን። ይሄ ነገር ነው አሁን ቀደም እሷ ላቀረበችው ጥያቄ እንቅፋት የሚሆነው። አሲሚሌትድ እንዳንሆን ስለምንፈራ አዳፕት ለማድረግና ያንን ሌላውን ከሌላው ጎን ያለውን መልካም ለመውሰድ it has become an obstacle. It is just a barrier. We couldn't relate to the Canadian culture. We have our fears of being assimilated, and because of that,
I also think though, yes, for sure, there's maybe negative quote unquote reasons why there was a hesitation or a rejection even of assimilation. But when you guys were, these are just assumptions, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're coming to a completely new country and starting over, I would imagine being with people who are like you and have the same thoughts as you and beliefs and values and these sorts of things probably was so comforting. It was like a piece of home when you're across an ocean from home too. So it's not it's very understandable, and it doesn't just have to be from a place of pride or fear. It could just be a place of trying to find comfort and not feel so out of your element.
Yeah, that's right. It's just being a flock. It's just being like a flock. We are creating a flock, but that flock is created, and it created a fear of, because of being in one group. It sees the other groups as enemy.
Yeah.
So that fear is the reason for not being able to adapt the other culture.
Yeah.
There are positive in it, but
there's definitely a balance that was not found.
I also think even looking now at like how I'm interacting with Canadian society, like you're also not welcomed, right? There's that element too where if I'm right now feeling that at times I'm not welcome, I can only imagine what you had to go through when coming here, right, in the first place. It's an additive or a multiplier to that in the sense that even if you're already like that, if your external environment at the same time is saying, we don't want you, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, yeah, you're gonna flock. And I think you see that not only in Abesha culture in Canada, you also see it amongst Asians, you see it amongst Arabs, you see it against other ethnicities in Canada too, right? You do have this nature of I want to better my community, which refers to because the greater community that I guess that roots the rest of the country that supposedly is there isn't as welcoming to people. So yeah, I think that definitely adds to that element too. It's like, yeah, like I'm having difficulty adjusting to this society. You're not taking me. There's these people here who I already relate to, already talk to. Obviously, I'm gonna go there. Obviously, I'm gonna try to make that bigger and better that. That's where my security is.
Yeah. Just we're giving you grace here. Just to add to that is the idea that like it's probably like you're taking like you have other priorities like getting a job, surviving, providing for your family, like especially I'm just guessing, but especially as men or like fathers of the household, I imagine that pressure is like tenfold. So it's like you take your peace and you take your like I don't know, where it's easy, you take it where you can. So like because there's already so many other things that are difficult, it's like another thing you don't have to think about is like, okay, now I'm gonna try and socialize with this person or whatever the case might be. I might challenge my way of thinking and these sorts of things. Like, well, I'm already challenged enough. Like I'm tired, you know. So I could get that too. That being said, I have a question for the parents. Just is there like I guess what are the things besides like assimilating in a very general sense, like are there specific things that you would look back on and be like, I would change this about the way that I approached living in Canada, or I approached having a family, like raising my children, or uh, I approached my marriage, or like, are there specific things that you would change, and what would they be? If that's not like too personal a question.
It's clear, I guess. It's clear.
Well, there are so many things in life when you grow. You know, when Mane was saying, I was growing up when I grew when I have Barakat. He was himself growing up. I was myself growing up when I have. And plus to that, in this society, we grew up in a society where you have the society at large or is supportive. You have uncles, aunties, and family at large. But here in this society, you have come into a society where the individual is everything. So coming to this society and trying to raise a kid by yourself in a culture you don't know, because my daughter goes to school and brings some idea which is foreign to me, and then I have to analyze that. I have to think how to deal with that. So
A new creative way to reject it.
Exactly.
well, in times, Fabian, there are days that were accepted. We have accepted your idea, and it doesn't mean everything is negative, Fabian. You can't say that.
No, I'm just joking.
Yeah.
نقطة لنا تنش. Okay, Bruno, sorry, Bruno. Sorry,
Yeah.
cut. Sorry.
So from what I see in life, when you are growing up, you make mistakes and you make right things. So there are some regrets, of course, in raising up. You see, all this I'm talking about is like the culture and everything that it's foreign to me. So add to that my young age, add to that all the financial burdens I have, add to that you going to school and bringing a foreign idea to me. You want to break me or what? So that's what's going on in a parents' minds. In parents' minds.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
እኔ ምንድን ነው የምለው ድጋሚ ኖ ቻንስ ድጋሚ በወለድ እና ቻይኒን ባገባ እና እነዚህ 3 ልጆች በወልድ ምንም የምቀይረው ነገር እንዳሁኑ ነው ማሳድጋቸው በራሳቸው እንዲያስቡ ትንሽ መስመር ለማሳየት እፈልጋለሁ በረከት ላይ ትንሽ ላስተካክል ይችላል ትንሽ ለምን ልጅ እንዲሆን አልፈቀድኩለትም ቢቢሲ ቁጭ ብሎ እንዲያያርገዋለሁ 6 አመቱ ላይ በትላልቅ መጽሐፍ እንዲያነብ እንደዚህ ገፋፋውት ነገር አለ እሱን ትንሽ ቀንስለታል ከዛ በተረፈ ግን ሳሳድጋቸው እንጆይ ያደረኩ ስለሆነ ያሳደግኳቸው እምቀይረው ነገር የለም እዛው ቦታ ላይ ሆነ ማለት ነው እዛው ቦታ አሁን የነበርንበት ቦታ ላይ ከነበረን ማለት ነው ከዛ በተረፈ ግን ሁኔታዎች ቢሻሻሉ ቢለወጡ ትንሽ የለም ለራሴ ጊዜ ባገኝ ራሴን የማገለግልበት ከልጆቼ ውጭ ራሴን የማረግበት ትንሽ ጊዜ ባገኝ ማዶትን ትንሽ መግራት ሞር እፈልጋለሁ really more እፈልጋለሁ ምክንያቱም they know that ማዶት ከመወለዷ በፊት ገና እና ቻይኒ ከመጋባታችን ምናምን በፊት ማዶት የምትባል ልጅ as a project ነው ልጅ ሆኜ ልጄ ስሟ ማዶት ይሆናል እንደዚህ ብዬ ብዙ ነገር አስቤ ነበር እና አንዳንድ ነገሩ ስለሌለ ቢኖረኝ ቻንስ ቢኖረኝ ሞር ትንሽ እንደዚህ ያደርጋለሁ ከዛ በተረፈ ግን እንደዚህ ነው ማሳድጋቸው ይሄንን ነው ማረጋው
all he's saying is
here comes the cookie cutter madot
yes okay say it madot
all I said is what everything he's saying he would change about me is pretty much he'd want me to grow my hair longer and he'd want me to be in piano for longer that's the end of it that was like his image of me was one long braid down my back playing piano that was it
daddy መጽሐፍ ሲጽፍ ቁጭ ብላ piano የምትጫወት that's it
he'd be there writing and I'd be in the background playing his music like that's what he wanted
for I think I relate to what Burhanu was saying as far as like I'm a parent I'm coming to this country I already have so many things going on what are these new ideas that I'm getting and I think as Habesha is like especially growing up here I think the big thing at least for me, I had trouble reconciling with for the longest time was like, it's going to be a very bold question is, did my parents do a good job? Did my parents give me what I needed to be given? And I've thought about that very deeply. And I think what I came to as far as the answer for myself was, given the context of everything that my parents had gone through, everything that the resources that were available to them, I'm surprised I turned out to be how I turned out to be. Right. So I think there's that also element that I also find with Habesha kids, generally speaking, too, is they're a little hard on their parents excessively. Like you do understand that things have happened to you and there are a lot of things to happen to blame as far as your experiences go. And that doesn't discount your hurt or your pain that you've gone through. There's also the realization that, again, exactly like you said, Burhanu, like I'm worried about money and putting food on the table. Like I could care less about this coming on because that's the primary need. And I think the biggest developmental gap from Habeshas that I've seen is that right there, which is like, how do you reconcile the relationship you had with your parents' upbringing, being an immigrant, knowing for the bulk of us that there weren't many resources available? Like, are you going to end up blaming your parents for everything, or are you going to recognize that they did the best that they could? And then now it's kind of your job to I don't say teach your parents, but I always told my parents this as far as like my adult relationship was the caregiver like that relationship is gone for the most part. For Habesha parents to have a relationship with it, like as an adult in your adult life, you need to be able to open up to them. You need to be able to to tell them things in your life, you need to be able to do that. So I think the big precursor there that I've historically had difficulty with is that adjustment period, where it's kind of like, okay, what am I going to tell them? What am I not going to tell them? What am I going to work with? What am I not going to bring up? And then being sensitive to also the experience they had to go through, right? Like a lot of people don't talk about, like, especially within the Eritrean community, there's a lot of PTSD just like from the stuff that they had to go through growing up. That stuff seeps into like how you're brought up. So yeah, I guess a little grace there too is, yeah, like you guys did have to go through a lot, and considering what you came from and what you had to go through, I think most parents did a really good job with the resources that were given to them.
That's also assuming, though, that the communication is there for this to be a known fact. A lot of Habesha communities isolate themselves, like parents, isolate all of their past experiences because they just don't want to mention it to their kids. Like they're super secretive. The kids don't know what has gone on in their parents' lives for this to even be a conversation to have, for them to want to hear their parents out, right? And then on the other side of it is like, your parents are so strict, they're so conservative, they're so like helicopter-y, for a lack of a better term, like they're helicopter parents. So you don't know what you can say to them. You don't know if I can even open up to, which is why there's so much mental health issues. There's so many things that, like, as a child growing up in this environment, you keep closed to yourself. And as a parent, you keep closed because you just don't want that click.
Yeah,
like,
and sorry, go ahead, Baraka.
I always had this rule of Marut, going off of what you were saying. I used to tell Marut all the time, like, do something, keep it secret. 4 years later, tell them.
Yeah.
4 years later, they can't get upset at you. You know what I mean? And that's so if comparing me and my sister, like our upbringing, I've done more things than my sister that my parents don't know of, right? Tons more things. If they knew that the things that I've done, they'd be freaking out. And part of that comes from also recognizing that, like, there's certain things you hold to your chest and there's certain things that you don't. But having said that, I do not recommend that approach because it's delayed. You're literally just like,
you're delaying the inevitable.
So I always say, like, I'm always jealous of my sister as the way she grew up, because although she got into conflicts with my parents all the time over things, there was at least that transparency as far as like not being able to hide. Whereas my approach was like, whenever I want to do something or open up a little bit about myself, I do something good or bigger that like validates what they want from me, which is a bit of a nasty dynamic to get into. But yeah, growing now over the past couple of years, that's obviously changed. I remember having a conversation with my mom and my dad, like, my relationship with both of you are independent of each other. I talk to you like you're my mom. I talk to you like my dad. I will open up to you, but that only comes to be if you can actually like not freak out when I tell you things and recognize that, you know, it's my life past this point, which I think a lot of Habesha parents have a challenge doing, because again, you've invested so much into this thing over the course of 20 years. It's literally your entire life. You're obviously going to be hovering over it all the time. So
it also is the question between, like, do you love, like, when you were giving birth to your child, when you decided to have a child, did you have this child thinking, I'm only going to love them if they do exactly as I say and they turn out the exact way I want, versus I'm going to love you, you're my kid, do as you please. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, is it conditional or is it unconditional? And I feel like a lot of Habeshas are scared of, like, I'm going to get cut off, I'm going to get kicked out, like, if I do open up about certain things.
እሱ ማለት እኮ ቢግ ትራክ ዝም ብለሽ ድራይቪንግ ላይሰንስ ላይ ያለው ሰው እየሰጠሽ ንዳ ማለት ነው። ምንም ሆነ ወደሃለው እሱ it doesn't work that way. ምንድነው የሚፈልግ ለመሰሽ እናቴ ልንገርሽ፣ ልጅ ኤውሲ ፓኬጅ የሆነ ነገር ልንገርሽ። ሰው ልጅ ሲሰጠን ልጅ እጅሽ ላይ ስትይጂ የሚሰማይ ስሜትና አሁን ልጅ ሳትወልጂ የምታወሪው ነገር አለ። ልክ ፓረንት ስትሆኚ የሚሰማይ ስሜት አለ። ስጦታ ብቻ አይደለም ያልሽው፣ ፕሪሺየስ የሆነ ጊፍት ብቻ አይደለም ያልሽው፣ ሪስፖንሲቢሊቲም ነው ያልሽው፣ ጀነሬሽን ነው ያልሽው። አንቺ አንድ ልጅ ነሽ፣ ግን ስሩዩ ጀነሬሽን ነው ያለው። አንቺ ጋር ካበላሽው ብዙ ነገር ነው ማበላሽው አንቺ ውስጥ። ስለዚህ እኔ ጋር የተሳሳትኩትን ስህተት እስከዛሬ ድረስ ሚስ ያደረኩትን ያበላሽሁትን ቤተሰቦቼ ያልሰጡኝን ነገር ሁሉ እሺ የተዘጋጀው ያለው አባት ሶ አባት ፍቅር ብቻ አይደለም የሚሰጠው ማለት ፓረንት አባት የሚለውን ዝም ብዬ አላብዛው። ፓረንቶች ፍቅር ብቻ አይደለም እሰማለሁ። ሰሙኛላችሁ? ሄሎ
We can hear you. We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. እና እንትን ፍቅር ብቻ አይደለም የምንሰጠው አባት ስንሆን ማለት ነው። ኃላፊነት አለብን ምን አለብን yes ለምሳሌ ሰክሰስ የሚባለው ምንድነው ራሱ ሰክሰስ ዲፋይን ማድረግ አለብን በምንድን ነው አንድ ሰው ሰክሰስፉል ሆነ ሲባል ትምህርት ስለተማረ ብቻ ነው ጥሩ ስራ ስላለው ነው ጤነኛ ስለሆነ ነው ኖ እሱ አይደል እኔ ሰክሰስ የምለው የፈለጋችሁትን ነገር ሆናችሁ ጥሩ ስራም ሆነ ምንም ትምህርት ምንም ሆነ ከዛ በኋላ ከናንተ አገኘን የምትሉትን ከያዛችሁ በኋላ የሚቀጥለውን ትውልድ ሲሰሩ የዛን ጊዜ ሰክሰስፉል ናችሁ ይባላል ያለበለዚያ ግን ለራሳችሁ የሚገባውን ነገር ያያዛችሁ መቀዳሶ
I think the danger in that though is
ልጨርስ ስለዚህ መውደድ የሚባለውን ነገር ቦልድሊ ከወሰድ ነው yes ምክንያቱም መውደድ በራሱ ሌላ ነገር አይጠብቅም ፓረንትነት መውደድ ብቻ ቢሆን ኖሮ ሌላ ኃላፊነት ባይኖረው yes እንወዳችሁ ብቻ ነበር በቃ ግን እሱ ብቻ አይደለም ካልቲቬት ማድረግ አለ እናንተ ኖሪሽ ማድረግ አለ ጭንቅላታችሁን እናበላለን ወዳችሁን እናበላለን መንፈሳችሁን እናበላለን በዚህ ውስጥ ሁሉ ፌል ባደረጋችሁት ነገር እኛም ልባችን ይሰበራል ፌል እንድታረጉ አንፈልግም ይሄ የማንኛውም ናቹራል የሆነ ነገር ነው አበሻ ስለሆነ አይደለም ጀርመናዊ ስለሆነ አይደለም ጥቁር ስለሆነ ነጭ ስለሆነ አይደለም ይሄ የማንኛውም ፓረንት ነው ሌላው ቀርቶ እንኳን እንደዚህ በእንስሶች ዓለም አኒማል ወርልድ ላይ ብንገባ ሰክሰስፉል እንዲሆን ይፈልጋል ያንበሳ ልጅ ልክ እንዳንበሳ እንዲሆን ይፈልጋል ይሄ ተፈጥሯዊ ነገር ነው ልጅን ግን ሰክሰስፉል ባንሆን ትወዱናላችሁ ወይ በጣም እንዲያም የሚያሳዝን አይነት መውደድ ሰዎች ኤክስፒሪየንስ የማያደርጉት አይነት መውደድ ምን ማለት ልብ የሚሰብር መውደድ ልትረጂው ማስሺ በጣም የምትወጁ አለነሳ ያለ የማይበርር ግብ ማለት ነው እና በጣም ነው የምትወጁ ትሳሽለታለሽ እና ፍቅርን በነገራችን ላይ በማውራት ቤተሰቦች አንዳንድ ቤተሰቦች አሉ ምስኪን ቤተሰቦች የሚወዱ የማይመስሉ ዝም ስለሚሉ ሐሳባቸው መግለጽ ስለማይችሉ መውደድ የማይችሉ ይመስላል ግን ይሄ በጣም ናቹራል የሆነ ነገር ስለሆነ yes እንወዳቸዋለን
there's also an element of control there right too that I find in general relationships me and my dad have always been pretty good in that sense like my dad many times has been the sounding board for a lot of things that I speak about more towards like latter parts of our relationship where I've started enforcing like hey these are my boundaries this is what I want to talk about this is what I agree on this is who I am but I'd say earlier on there's this false sense of control with most parents where you think by oh bedtime is this or you got to go to church or you got to get good grades that there's a repeated outcome like there's like 3 variables school religion and then that's it equals success and that ends up being a dangerous thought because it gives parents a really really high sense of control where it's like if I can control these variables my kid's going to be successful where in reality that's not the case like most kids spend in their early developmental years probably less than 10-15% of the time with their parents right and I think where the gap I found growing up early on was rather than imposition of like rules or frameworks or like you got to do this I think the better approach would have been I call it being anti-fragile to some extent where it's kind of like being able to flow like your life happens random things happen at a time being able to not set expectations surrounding it and then being able to react to whatever happens right like that to me is the optimal way whereas with upbringing generally I'd say early on for me especially not so much later on was it narrowed my perspective in the world and I think a lot of kids have that too like I remember going to church and them being like go to church tell them about Jesus you know like do your thing I didn't do it but I've always saw kids around me do it and it's like that's the worst advice you can give to a kid going at that age and it's just like this crazy sense of control where it's like you do this outcome will come to be which I find is a little domineering to some extent by some parents yeah and I think that's probably the biggest inhibitor is control but again I always empathize with them too on that sense where you spend so much resources on something your time your effort your emotional energy yeah like you're gonna losing it is going to be the worst. It's a really, really big reality that you don't want to face. So especially when you're in a new environment.
Yeah, I was just gonna agree with that. The idea that it's also just like outside of like rooting for your child's success and like trying to push them towards success in any way that you can is like safety too. Like, well, I don't know if this is like, maybe I'm not a mother, but maybe like I'm imagining as a mother, as like a parent, like when I think of like my parents didn't let me do anything. When I think of that, it's like back in the day, obviously I was so frustrated. But now when I think of having a child, it's like, I'm going to be in the bushes, like watching you. Like I'm making sure that nothing is happening to you because that's my baby. You know what I mean? So like, I get that too. Speaking like on the other stuff that was mentioned, I think where there's a disconnect is that it's not that our generation or like, well, I'll speak for myself. Like for me, it was never really like, I only want love. Like I don't want the negatives, but I feel like the negatives were voiced so much more than the love was. So there was like a very big imbalance in the sense of, I can understand when Madot, you're saying it's like, it comes off as conditional because all you're hearing is you have to do, well, a lot of what I was hearing was you have to do this or else XYZ. You have to do this or else XYZ. It's not really an explanation of you have to do this, but I still love you. Like I'm doing this because I love you. This is because I care about you. Like there's a lot of stuff that on the loving side went very unspoken. So it was very easy to feel like, okay, if I'm not doing what you want, then like you're going to be upset. And like the love is not like, the love is just not nearly shown as much as like the anger or the upset or the consequences to like actions that you shouldn't have done or were against like what your parents wanted you to do and that sort of thing. So I feel like it was just an imbalance in that sense. Again, totally understandable. I would imagine in the context of like the way they were raised too. I don't imagine that love was something that was like super expressed from their parents to them. So it's just also like, maybe it was, I don't want to say it's easier, but like maybe because it was like something that they experienced in the culture in Ethiopia, it was more normalized. So when you come here and it's like you're watching all these shows and these families are like, I love you, son, I love you, daughter, or you know what, you shouldn't have done this, but even though you did this, I still love you, and this sort of thing. It's like something that almost like creates this desire that like, oh, that's what I want. That's like almost the standard, I guess, or an expectation or something. And it's like a very big disconnect between like their reality and our reality and like the cultures and all this sort of stuff. And to talk about the side of mental health, like Barakat, you were talking about like PTSD and these sorts of things that are like probably so prevalent in our parents' generation, but they're not even dealing with like their like own issues of things that they've seen and things that they've gone through. I just like, it just makes so much sense why, like, if it's someone that's like their children or like kids from our generation or younger, it's like, what do you mean you have this? Like, get over it. Like, you're just making this up, or like you're being soft. It's this society that has put this idea in your head. And it's like, well, like, what other response would you expect? Like, I've been through a war. I moved across like the world and started a whole new life, and you don't see me complaining. You don't see me having any issues with it. So like, how then you living this easy life could you have any sort of issues? Like, just move on, get over it. Like, I could also see that too. And it's honestly heartbreaking because I can't imagine how much they're not dealing with, or how much stuff is hurting them, but they're not acknowledging it or taking a moment to, I don't know.
Yeah, okay. ገብቶኛል ፖይንትሽ። እኔ አሁን የምትይው ነገር ከልጆቼ ቀደም እኔ ራሴ ኤክስፒሪየንስ አድርጌያለሁ። ያውቃሉ። የምደብቀው ነገር የለኝም። ዲፕረስድ በመሆንበት ሰዓት ላይ they know that። አንደኛ እኔ እንትን አልወድም፣ ደመና አልወድም፣ ዝናብ አልወድም ከድሮ ጀምሮ። I have a big problem። እና ያውቃሉ ልጆቼ። የምናደደው ሳይነግሩኝ እኔ ያለፍኩትን ነገር እያወቁ ክፍት ነኝ እኔ። just I'm an open person። ምንም ነገር ቢነግሩኝ መያዝ እንደምችል እያወቁ ሲደብቁኝ ነው የምናደደው። ምክንያቱም ቀድሞ ያዩኛል እኔ ፕሮብሌም ውስጥ እንዳለ ያውቃሉ። ያው እናንተ ፊት ለፊት ነው የምናገረው። I have no problem ራሴን ለእንትን ለማለት እና ዲፕረስ በመሆንበት ሰዓት ላይ ያውቃሉ ምን ያህል እንደምሰቃይ፣ ምን ያህል እንደሚያመኝ። እንደዛ ሆኜ እየሰራው እንደሆነ ያውቃሉ። ከደበቁኝ እናደዳል። ፍቅር ግን love by self abused የሆነበት ቤት ካልሽኝ ግን እኛ ቤት ነው abused የሆነው። extremely በጣም የበዛ ፍቅር ነው የወሰዱት ልጆቹ። እንዲያውም ድሬን አድርገውኛል ነው የምለው። ከልቤ መናገር ይችላሉ። ልጆቼ ነፍሴ እስኪጠፋ ነው የምወዳቸው። ዝምዬ ብቻ አይደለም እናታቸውም they see that literally ያዩታል። ፍቅር ያዩታል። ቤታችንን ያቆመው ላቭ ነው ያቆመው። ነፍሳችን እስኪጠፋ ነው የምንወዳቸው እና they know that። ግን ምንድነው የሚያልፉበትን ነገር አለማወቅ ያበሳጨኛል። አንዳንድ ጊዜ ሐኪም አይደለሁም። ብዙ ነገር ስለ ሕክምና እንደዛ አይነት ነገር ላይ ማቀው ነገር የለም። አንዳንድ ስሞች የሚገርሙኛል። ግን እኔ ማልፍባቸው ህመሞች አሉ በስነ ስርዓት በቃ የለም። አሁን እኮ በአማርኛ ድብርት ይባላል፣ ደበረኝ ምናምን ይባላል በአማርኛ። እዚህ ጋር ዲፕሬሽን የምንለው ማለት ነው። እና በዛ ውስጥ አልፋለሁ እኔ በጣም። በተለይ ክረምቱ ሲገባ በረከት ያውቃል። ልክ እዚህ ሀገር ዊንተሩ ሲገባ ስቃይ ውስጥ ነው ማልፈው እኔ። በጣም ነው የምሰቃየው። እና ግን እነሱ እዛ ውስጥ ገብተው ሳይነግሩኝ ሲቀሩ ግን ያበሳጨኛል።
አሁን
እኔ ግልጽ የኔን እያዩት እንዴት አይነግሩኝ እላለሁ እንጂ መደበቁን አንተናለም። በነገራችን ላይ ይሄንን አሁን እናንተ እንደዚህ አይነት ፕሮግራም አለ ብላችሁ ስትነግሩኝ በጣም ደስ ብሎኝ ነው የመጣሁት። ዋይ ያውቃሉ ሀበሻ እንደዚህ አይነት ነገር ውስጥ እንደምናልፍ እናውቃለን። ስለዚህ ከጓደኞቼ ጋር ሆነን እዚህ ውስጥ እኛ ካልሰራለን እነዚህ ልጆች የሆነ ነገር ካላደረግን ችግር ውስጥ እየወደቁ ነው ልጆቻችን። እኛም ማፍነ ነው ይዘነው ብለን የሆነ ሙቭመንት ጀምረናልና በጣም ደስ ብሎኝ ነው የመጣሁት። አልፍበታለሁ ፕሮብሌሙን። ልጆች አይደሉም እኔ ራሴ ያለፍኩበት ነው።
I think this is where አንተ ዳድ early ያልከው በአንዳንዴ ፍቅርም በሚሰማበት ሲያመክም ነው ያልከው ነገር ነበር። አሁን እኔ ለአንተ መልስ የምሰጥልህ አሁን ማሩት ካንተ ጋር ክፍት በጣም ናት ካንተና ከማለት ጋር right means very different. I like I said 4-year rule, very delayed. But that
better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yeah, and that was always my thing. And the reason where that came from partially was also like growing up, I saw how hard my mom worked. I saw how hard my parents worked, right? It was like there was problems that I was going through. It's like there's the element, there's the energy you have to expend already adjusting, then there's the energy you have to expend like maintaining relationships, and then there's the energy you have to expend maintaining yourself. And then it comes down to a question of like, okay, I want to do this thing. Am I going to ask and do it? And then potentially conflict arises from that just because I'm not at that age where I can have that back and forth with my parents. Or is it like I'm like my dad always said this earlier, like I've always been very good at taking care of myself, like very selfish in that sense. I will never get hurt essentially. So I looked at that as like, yeah, as long as I don't get hurt, I don't have to say anything. And then if the time comes and opportunity comes, as long as I don't get hurt, like there's no reason why create conflict, why stir the pot. But now where that is not a good approach to take that I found is as I got older, there's this element of my entire life, like you're talking about identity, like how do you assimilate your identity being Canadian and Ethiopian? there's a whole part of my identity that my parents didn't know, right? And that was like, you can call it like quote unquote Canadian side, which becomes difficult, like long term, like maintaining that duality where it's like, I'm like this with my parents and I'm like this with this person. So eventually it gets really draining and you have to reconcile all of those. And it becomes a lot more difficult to reconcile all of those if you've been hiding or if you haven't been as forthcoming, which is why I'm jealous of my sister in that sense, because that process for her is a lot easier to do. Yeah.
They're running because we walked.
Yeah. Yeah. Essentially.
He's running because he's walking because I ran.
And actually, I will say that at this point.
Yeah, I can see that too.
Part of my ability now to be open with my parents and very forthcoming with my parents is because I've seen all the things my sister has been forthcoming with them by.
It's both. It's both.
Yeah, it goes both ways.
Yeah. We also had it very, very different though. Like on my side, I've had mental health issues since I was a kid. Like it's always been prevalent in my life. I don't remember a point in my life where I didn't. So when I was in high school and I was like, okay, now I have like the tiniest little bit of freedom, I was like, I'm going to jump at every single opportunity that comes my way. My dad was super, super forthcoming with this kind of stuff. Like my mom, it wasn't a conversation that would happen. She'd start slapping her chest. She'd start screaming to the Lord. Like it was not a conversation. My dad, on the other hand, because he did go through phases where he was like us, like he was drinking, he was smoking, like he experienced these things. He's sober and he's very religious, but he experienced these things. So I sat down and I would have these conversations with him while Barakat is hiding. So for me, it was like, I can talk to him about these things because I'm at the point where it's crippling. Like he can see it. I'm at home all day. I'm not leaving my room. I'm not talking to anyone for months on end. So it's more like, I'm going to care for my daughter. Let me check in. Let me have these conversations. Let's open up this conversation because I'm dealing with it. But my dad also wasn't open at this point either. So he's like, I'm dealing with it. I can see my daughter dealing with it. Now it's time for me to jump in and like, let's build this. So was it me per se? I would say no. It was just our mental health together deteriorated.
አይደለም እናቴ ይኸውልሽ አንቺ አሁን አንደርስታንድ ያደረግሽው ነው የተናገርሽው እኔ ደግሞ ልናገር እዚህ ጋር እኔ ኖርማሊ ሲንስ ትንሽዬ ልጅ ሆኜ ቤተሰቦቼ ያውቃሉ እንደዚህ አይነት ችግር እንዳለብኝ ቤተሰቦቼ ያውቃሉ ግን ያው ዝም ብለው ነው በቃ የለም ይተዋል ምናምን ጸበል ይሄድ ምናምን ይላሉና ራሴን ቴኬር አድርገዋለሁ በእኛ ኮሚኒቲ ውስጥ እንደዚህ አይነት ነገር ካወጣሽ ስም ነው የሚሰጥሽ እና ስም ነው የሚሰጥሽ ግን ችግር የለብኝም ምንም ነገር ኋላ ቢለጥፉ ምንም ችግር የለብኝም ግን you guys ታዩታላችሁ እኔ ላይ ታዩታላችሁ በስነ ስርዓት ሲያመኝ ማውራት አልፈልግም እነግራችኋለሁ ነው አሁን አልፈልግም ምንም ነገር እላችኋለሁ ከዛ በኋላ ዲል አድርጌ ስጨርስ ከዛ እንትላለሁ እናንተ ጋር ግን በሚመጣበት ሰዓት ላይ ልጆቼን ያሳደግኳችሁ ኦፕን አድርጌ ምንም ነገር ሲመጣ እንድትነግሩኝ አድርጌ ነው ያሳደግኳችሁ ምንም አይነት ነገር ካልነገራችሁኝ ለኔ ያንን ነገር አምጥታችሁ ካልነገራችሁኝ ሌላውን ነገር እንደምትነግሩ በምንም ነገር አይ አንዳንድ ሰው ዝምበል ምናምን የሚል የማይናገር ቤተሰብ ቢሆን ኦኬ አፍናችሁ ታስቀምጡታላችሁ ግን አብራችሁ የምትሉት አቅፎሽ የሚያስተኛሽን አባት ስንት አመት ሙሉ ገላሽን የሚያጥብሽን አባት ለሱ ካልነገርሽው እንዴት አርጎ ያውቃል ገባሽ እንዴት አርጎሽ ያውቃል ማወቅ የሚባለው ትልቅ ነፃ አርጌ ስላሳደግኩሽ መናገር ያ ሁለታችንም ብላይም እያደረኩሽ አይደለም በነገራችን ላይ ግን በጣም ነው ማዝነው እንደሚያናድደኛል ያንን ነገር ቶሎ ፋይንድ አውት አለ ማድረግ በጣም የሚያበሳጭ really
ነገር you and Madot the relationship that you have is compared to what other parents can talk about it's very
we are very open
so why you miss that
no ማለት አንተ ደበከኝ የምትለው ነገር already ያገኘውን ነገር ብዙ ወላጆች ይፈልጉታል ማለት ነው አንተ ደበክሽኝ ምንም I'm not discounting your experience but I'm telling you it's
why አባቴ ይሲ ለዛን ጊዜ አጠገባ ቆም ነበር ለካያደል በዛ ጊዜ ቁጭ ብዬ ገባ ሀልፕ አረጋታለሁ እንዴት እንደምታረግ እኔ ደግሞ ከብዙ አመት በኋላ እንዴት አርጌ ይሄን ነገር ኦቨርካም እንደማደርገው አውቃለሁ ከመድኃኒት ውጭ አውቀዋለሁ ገባ ከተወሰነ ጊዜ በኋላ ማፈን ሲገባ ሶሳይቲ ውስጥ ቸርች ምናምን ማታወራቸው ነገሮች አሉ ይሄን ነገር ለፓስተር በነገረው አጋንንት አለበት ብሎ ነው ሊጸልይልም ይለኝ I know that የቱ ጋር እንደሚሄድ I know that ገባ ስለዚህ እኔ መንፈሳዊ ነገር ወዳለሁ ግን አንድ ለማደርግበት የራሴ መንገድ አለ ሰርቶልኛል በጣም ሰርቶልኛል ይሄንን ሁሉ አመት ሰርቫይቭ ያደረኩበት ስለሰራልኝ የራሴ ሜተድ አለ ራሴን ትሪት ማድረግበት መንገድ አለ ከዛ አልፌ ወጥቼ ነው ሶሳይቲ ውስጥም እንዳለ ስለማቅ ይሄ ነገር ደግሞ በብዛት ሀበሻው ውስጥ ነው ያለው በብዛት ያለው ሀበሻ ውስጥ ምክንያቱም በብዙ እንደ ቀደም እንዳልኩት ነው በብዙ አስቀያሚ ኤክስፒሪየንስ ውስጥ አልፈናል ሀበሻ በተለይ the old generation ስለዚህ ብዙ ችግር አለ የፋሚሊ ሂስትሪ የምናቀው ነገር የለም ቢያቅም ባል ለሚስቱ አይነግርም ሚስት ለባሏ አትነግርም ልጅ ለምናምን አባት ለልጁ አይነግርም እንደዛ አይነት ነገርና መስራት ይገባናል እና ደግሞ ቀላል ነገር ነው የሚገርመው ነገር በጣም ቀላል የሆነ ነገር ነው ሌላ ምንድን ነበር አንደኛው ጥያቄ ረሳሁት I missed the point ምንድን ነበር የጠየቀች የሆነ ጥያቄ ጠይቃኝ ነበር ረሳሁት እና ይሄ ምንድን ነበር የጠየቀች ነበር መመለስ ፈልጌ ነው
Ooh, I have no idea what I asked. I have zero clue.
The point there too as well with the sharing of like information. There's also the element of boundaries. Andan gize, like generally speaking, I'm not only private with my parents, I'm private with like everything.
Yeah.
And that's just who I am to some extent. And I think the boundary level there has been very clear too between like what I share with my parents, what I don't. Definitely a little bit overdid it when I was younger, but yeah, again, that's the one thing that I encourage for sure is when you're older, it's very easy to have conversations because your parents respect you a lot more, I find. But I also recognize for people that they can't have those conversations, and in those cases, it's like in the end, it is your life. You have to decide how you run it, and if something is inhibiting it so much that it's affecting you, like talk to it. If conversation isn't receptive with your parents, then it's like walk away. I've done that before with parents. Like I'll be a little open here. Like there was a moment in my life where I was in conflict with like my mom and my dad, and it was a very, very clear boundary where I was like, okay, like I just need space. Let me be. My dad responded to it well. Let me be, and then conversation opened up right away. My mom didn't. It was more of the pressing back and forth, and that delayed things a little bit more. But one thing I got from that experience is not kind of letting my stance down as far as like, this is what I want, this is who I want to be. And I definitely encourage that. It sucks, like didn't talk to my mom for a bit, but in the end it ended up being good for both of us because one person's open, one's not. And I think that's going back to the identity thing, that's the biggest thing that I found as a challenge is assimilating who I am as far as how I've grown up, who I am as far as like how I transitioned in Canada, who I am as far as with my parents, who I am in work, and then forming a cohesiveness amongst all those, where it's rather than going from jumping from one to the other, it's more like it's more grounded at its singular.
Yeah. To your point about this, because I think it's really very important, and it's also an experience that many people are having and haven't and are struggling with, let's say. Because we also lose a lot of people as they navigate through this process that you talked about. So could you share how you reconcile those pieces to where you are now? And at the same time, if you could also speak to what is it that parents need to know about this? And what are some of the signs that they should be aware of in terms of maybe behaviorally that children exhibit? And how can parents engage their children in this conversation, and how could their children engage their parents in this kind of a conversation?
I guess the biggest thing for me is it came from like that question again, like who am I? Like am I Habesha? Am I Canadian? What part of me am I putting forth? What part of me am I not putting forth? And then as you do that, that led to like self-reflection. That's like, I guess step one, I would say, is like I remember sitting down for like when I got back from Germany, like in my room for like weeks, and I just kind of like sat down in my head and replayed everything that I could remember back to back and just started poking at it, And then at that point, that triggered like, okay, am I right or are they wrong? Or like what is the the true reality of my experience. And then when that happened, my initial reaction was like, be binary. It's either them or it's me, which is never really the case, right? And then that kind of like took me in for a loop, like tons of emotions start to come up. And then I started seeing a therapist, definitely recommend it. That was the biggest thing. That allowed me to like have that conversation with somebody else that could point at whether it was me or whether it was my parents, or at least validate what I was feeling without having to worry about the conflict. And then that way, that allowed me to kind of resolve or reconcile with those experiences without having like to encounter them. And then now, once those are resolved, it's like, okay, now you can start to have a conversation because they're not triggering you all the time. And even if they're triggering you, you can have a little bit of empathy with it. So that I'd say would be that was the longest stretch. I did that for like 2.5 years. Yeah, expensive, not accessible to a lot of people, but if you can do it, even if it's like once a month, definitely do it. It helps. And then I think after that, it becomes like the biggest challenge for me, especially as an Habesha, was I viewed my parents as a unit. Meaning I have a relationship with my parents. I don't have a relationship with like my dad as an individual or my mom as an individual. And I think part of that comes to be like the cohesiveness in most Habesha families where mom and dad are like together. So you kind of see them as a unit. And then that allows you to kind of like compartmentalize your experience with each of them for the most part. Whereas with my dad, all of this was very, very easy in the sense that from a young age, like my dad said, like I used to sit down beside him watching news. We talked always. Like I remember being 8, asking him like, "What's sex?" And my dad was like, "You really want to know?" And I was like, "Yeah." He told me. So we've had like that level of openness in many, many respects. So from that perspective, it's easier. It was a lot easier. With my mom was different because there was the element of I always empathize with her because she was young when she had me. She was 17. So there's that element of growing up that was brought up, which is like even crazier for her, like you're not even a woman yet. So with that conversation is a little bit more challenging because in that case, when you have a parent who has been through a lot, you also have to be sensitive to their needs. So I remember telling my mom all the time, like validating her experience, being like, oh, like I say this all the time, for what you had given to you, you've like killed it. Like no one would have been able to do what you've been able to do with given the resources. But at the same time, it's also saying like the experiences that I have or I've gone through, although they may be related, are completely independent of like your experience. Like what I'm feeling has nothing to do with you. It might be some component of it, but don't internalize it. So I think that's the next component, which is like getting to the point where you can get your parents not to internalize how you're feeling, because that just makes the conversation a lot easier. If you're like you're feeling sad and they get upset, they're internalizing it. And then once you kind of get that through that step, then it becomes a lot easier. And now it's just like that's where I'm at. Where I'm gotten both my parents not to internalize how I feel my experiences, makes it very easy to talk to them. So past that, I don't really know. Kind of working through it. Yeah.
Yeah, for myself, I would say the biggest shift in like for context, like the house that I grew up in was like really authoritarian, I think it is. And just like very much like parents, kids, like not really a relationship in the sense of like emotions or like conversations or these sorts of things, but it's more so like this is what is expected of you, and my job is to deliver. And that could be like grades, it could be behavior, it could be like in any sense. And for me, it got really rough like in my late teens because I was like just like for a long time it's like you just kind of have to accept what they say because you just are not in any position to oppose it. And then it just got like really, really frustrating and really tiring. It's like I'm really annoyed of being on the outside of like what felt like life. Like I'm seeing my peers like having more and more freedom and being able to do more things, and like I don't really see that changing for myself, and I feel like I'm missing out on so many experiences and all these sorts of things, and like it is isolating too. So it was just like it just got so frustrating. There was like really like a period of conflict that was just like we just could not see eye to eye at all. And at that point, unfortunate, well, not, I mean, it's unfortunate for many reasons, but like my mom passed away, and like I think I have such a huge regret of not being able to, or like regret, yes, I have regret in some senses, but also like I wish that I had the chance to know her as an individual. I feel like at the point that she passed away, I only saw her as a parental figure. So I didn't get to know like her life and these sorts of things, and like what makes her her, and like specific characteristics. And like, I mean, you know it on some level, but not like in the nuance that you can understand it in once you're an adult. But I also just think like I wasn't like at the age to be able to appreciate the things that I can appreciate now about the way that our parents raised us. Then like I was still at home, and there was like a lot of disagreements between my dad and I. The big thing that I think that helped our relationship the most was moving out. Like honestly, I think having that space and like being able to kind of operate as an individual, and like not to say that like I know there's like people who like get this like once they have freedom it's like all bets are off, like I'm going crazy, everything you told me not to do, I'm doing it. Like you told me not to eat 5 jars of Nutella, I'm eating those 5 jars of Nutella, I'm doing everything. Okay, it wasn't even like that. It was just the ability to choose, like that was like such a huge thing for me. And I honestly think like having that ability to choose created I don't know, a little bit of peace, a little bit of comfort, a little bit like, okay, like I can kind of control my life a little bit, like it's not someone else that's running the ship for me all the time. And like also like there's like less fear, I guess, in a sense of like any sort of consequences. So it's like, okay, well, I'm gonna tell you that I did this because what are you gonna do? I'm not at home, you can't do anything to me. Like this sort of thing. And I honestly think like it helped so much. And not to say that like even now David will be like, you're 30 years old, like you're almost 30 years old, like you can tell your dad this, like grow up, like these sorts of things. But it's like, well, no, I can't. Like I really can't. Like it's just not like when you're operating this way for 29 years, it's not something that you just switch off. So like it's definitely still something that is taking time to adjust to. And maybe it is a case of like what Barakat was saying in terms of being able to draw boundaries of like, at the end of the day, like maybe my dad doesn't need to know everything. Like it's not a matter of getting to a point where I can tell him everything, but just like maybe getting to a point where it's like, okay, I don't feel like I'm hiding things from you or like this sort of thing. And it's just like a kind of mutual respect. And honestly, like I'm probably not giving my dad enough credit, and like maybe doing a little disservice to say that like maybe he can't handle what I would tell him. But like on my end of things, like it's just still not a place where I feel like necessarily that comfortable. But for sure, like I think Barakat had said this, there's also a level of respect that like I feel like my dad has for me too. Like maybe there's something that's like, oh, you can't live on your own, you can't do this, you can't do that without me. So maybe there's like a little bit of a lack of respect. So it's like, I have to tell you what to do. I have to direct you. And now that that's gone, it doesn't level the playing field, but it does make it just a little bit less like far apart. So I think that helps like our conversations and our dynamics. It's not like he's talking to his daughter. It's like, oh, I'm speaking to another adult who has experiences in life, who has opinions and legitimate points of view based on the things that they've gone through, and they might even in some respects know better than me, because this is not an arena that I'm familiar with the way that my child is familiar with. So it is like teaching in a way, maybe more convincing, I would say, because maybe you're not really open to being taught, but maybe kind of being like discussed with. I don't know.
I agree with everything you said there too. Like I remember that, I don't know if you remember, I moved to the Netherlands for a few months, and when I came back, like the first thing my dad said was like my behavior was completely different. Like he said I looked like I matured a lot. And from that point, like that's one key inflection point I can remember in our relationship. There's like these key points where I've done these things, where I've accomplished these things, and I've gone out on my own and I've done something. And each one of those kind of adds like, I don't say like a report card take, but it's kind of like, I have to worry less. I have to worry less. I have to worry less. I have to worry less, which I think is healthy. It's like the same way you would, that's how I would raise my child. It's like, okay, if my kid goes away for a day and comes back and nothing has happened, it's like, okay, they can handle a day, you know? So I think there's that element too of experience which Abishai kids find very difficult too, because it's like, how do you go out into the world when your parents are not letting you? You can do two approaches, do what my sister did. Just do it and then say sorry right away, or do what I did, which I don't recommend. But I think only through that is when, like you were saying, Fabian, like once you've like gone out and made your own choices, they kind of respect you a little bit more.
It's kind of because you're shifting from being a dependent versus being like a self-sustaining individual, that you're not looking to them to give you money. You're not looking at them to keep the roof over your head. Like you don't have that fear that they're going to take something away that you need. It's like, now I have everything I need. I can give myself everything that I need. Let's focus on our relationship so that the rest of our lives aren't as crappy as the past was. You know what I mean?
So having said that, our listeners are going to have their own takeaway from this very rich conversations that we've been having so far. And this isn't in any way, shape, or form to sort of direct them in their thinking, because they're going to think for themselves, and that's what we want. As a final question of sorts, what is the takeaway for you? And what is it that you would like them to take away from what you've said today so far?
Are you asking me?
I guess.
Or is this like an everybody? Okay, for me,
an everybody question.
Okay. For me personally, I would say from this conversation, takeaway would be talk to your parents. Like, as you've heard my brother and my father say, like I was the loudmouthed one. I'm not saying like I turned out better than the rest of my family, but like in terms of communication, I think personally, I think I have the best relationship with everybody as individuals, because of the fact like I was never scared. I never hesitated when I was going to do something. I never hesitated when I wanted to say something. If there was an opinion I wanted to voice, it was voiced. If it comes down to somebody in the family having a loud mouth, like it's always going to be me, and it's always going to, like, I'm going to be heard. You know what I mean? And if you're a child in a Habesha family and you're feeling like you're unheard, you're feeling like you've been pushed aside and like you can't say, go and speak up. Like they might get mad in the moment. Doesn't matter. Suck it up. Like take whatever punches they're going to throw at you. Because like when you're thinking long term, it's the most beneficial thing you could do for yourself is opening up to your family, saying what you want to say. And like if they shun you, they shun you. I'm so sorry, but like these are people that are supposed to be good people in your life. And if they're not going to be good people in your life, then be the individual you are. Flourish as your own butterfly. Come to that later. I don't know. That's me.
I would probably say the same thing. For me, Madot was probably like the second child in my family. I'm the youngest, so for me, it was kind of like I didn't obviously, like I still had a lot of like pressure to do things. I think actually it was more so my dad was like very liberal for me because you know, everything that happened, my mom passing away and already having raised to some extent 2 children, it was just like easier for me. But for me, I always like stayed inside. So it was kind of like the other way around where my dad would like force me to do things. Like he would force me to go out to the garden and yell at me if I didn't want to, you know, help him with gardening. And he would like try and make me do stuff like I and in like art and stuff. So he would make me walk to like a place to like I forget what it's called, but like this place where you have to like paint on like mugs and stuff, and he would force me to go there because he's like, you're not going outside, you have to go outside. And he would force me to do things when it was more of like a personal issue. So that was kind of the dynamic for me. And I think like for Fabian, it was probably like she's saying late teens where it got the worst. For me, it was probably like just like high schoolish, where I just was always mad. There was always conflict because of just conflicting interests in what my dad thought was best for me and what I thought I wanted. And I think what I would say, like if you're someone like me who has that sort of like if you were raised the way that I was raised, yeah, like Madot was saying, just trying to communicate as much as you can. I was still very like I voiced my needs a lot, or what I wanted, I voiced it a lot. And I think just trying to understand my dad's perspective, but also trying to understand what I need in this world, you know, as an Habesha or as a Black person as well. Just understanding that there's like multiple perspectives that are like worth considering when you're having conversations like that is really important. And just like making, I think also like having sort of like a mediator, like I don't know, like I think therapy with my dad would have helped a lot. I think it came down to Fabian being the one who was often like the mediator in conflict, and she'd be like, okay, you're cutting her off right now, you shouldn't cut her off. And just like having a third person or a third party like actually helping facilitate that was really, really, really helpful. And I don't know if I would have been able to be at the point where I am with my dad if it wasn't for that. So yeah.
You're welcome.
Okay.
You want to take it from here, David?
Sure. I guess the takeaway, I feel like this is maybe like the third kind of conversation in this space or format that we've had. And it seems to like always come back to one point with me, because for myself, I feel like historically, like I was so upset for so long with the way that my parents handled raising me, I guess specifically, that I could only see the negatives for so long. And so like really at this point, like stepping back and like being able to say like, okay, like there was so much more behind the scenes that was going on that I wouldn't have been able to appreciate, or even if I knew about it, I wouldn't have been able to really think of like the magnitude and like the extent and like just how difficult it must have been to be in their position, just to have more grace with your parents. And I know that it's maybe not even necessarily a grace that you might have seen extended towards yourself, but just not necessarily accepting their expression of love, but more so understanding that even though it might not be something like I love you like so explicitly, or just any sort of like very clear expression of love, like there's love there. And not to say like that's not the standard, that's not what we're aiming for, we can do better for sure, but just knowing that, I don't know, it's like so easy to just like kind of take away the bad, but know that like the intention is there. The intention is there, even if the execution isn't there, that there's so much like love and care behind what our parents did for us, and what they continue to do for us. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think for me, it's like, one thing I did growing up was like I started working really young. I got my first job when I was 14. And I think where that came from at the time wasn't necessarily good, but what that allowed with my parents was like, okay, he's making his own money. He's covering his own things, you know, I don't have to worry about it as much. So I think there's also an element of freedom there where if you are growing up and you want more freedom, also show that, you know, you could handle it. You have to, like, to some extent, you have to do the things that people do when they can handle responsibility or freedom or having those conversations. So that was the first thing. I think that was my biggest saving grace. Like, I did my degree really quickly. That helped me to like go under the radar with my parents for the most part. Like, I still went out, I partied, I had a great time, but I was only able to do that because without the worry of my parents, because I was clearly not messing my life up. I was going in a good trajectory. So I think there's that element too, where like the conversations do get easier, not necessarily when you're pleasing them, but when you're showing that you're working at something and that you're capable. Therapy definitely helps. I think before even approaching a conversation with your parents, if you haven't resolved all those things on your own, and you don't necessarily need them to do that, it's very difficult to talk about it if you haven't even worked through it yourself. So first work through it yourself. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you. Gashbranu had to leave a little bit earlier. So Gashmani, I turn it over to you to close this out.
ሌላ ሰዎች የሚሰሙኝ ከሆነ ይሄንን ላለው በተለይ ለወላጆች የምናሳድጋቸውን ልጆች እንዲበልጡን አድርገን ማሳደግ አለብን። ከኛ የተሻሉ በእውቀትም በንግግርም ሐሳባቸውን በመግለጽም ፍላጎትም ከኛ የተሻሉ እንዲሆኑ እና በእኛ ሊሚትድ በሆነች ዕውቀት ልጆቻችን መለካት አይገባንም። አንድ ሁለተኛ በጣም ግልጽ መሆን አለብን። ትልቅ አባት ትልቅ ኢምፐርሰን ማለት ነው፣ ግን ትንሽ መሆን አለብን። በጣም ትንሽ መሆን አለብን ለልጆቻችን ማለት ነው። በጣም ማለት ምንም ነገር ልንደብቃቸው አይገባም። ስናሳድጋቸው ማወቅ የሚገባቸውን ነገር ልናሳውቃቸው ይገባል። እኔ አንዳንድ ሰው አለ ጓደኛ አድርጌ ያሳድግ ያለ ሰው አልቀበልም። ልጄ ጓደኛ እንዲሆን አልፈልግም። አባት ነው መሆን የምፈልገው፣ ሞዴል መሆን እፈልጋለሁ። በነገራችን ላይ አሁን ለልጆቼ ፊት ነው እኔ ጴንጤ ነኝ። መጠጥ አልጠጣም። የማልጠጣው መጠጥ መጥፎ ስለሆነ አይደለም። ልክ መሊ ይሄ ትንሹ ልጄ 18 ዓመት ሲሞላ እኔ ነኝ ውስኪ ገዝቼ መጠጣው። በጣም ነው ናፈቀኝ መጠጣት፣ ግን ማላረገው ምሳሌ ላለመሆን ነው እንጂ ከዛኛው ከሃይማኖቱ መንገድ አይደለም። የለም መጠጣት መጥፎ ነው ከሚባለው አይደለም። ማሳየት የሚገባንን ነገር ምሳሌ ሆነን ብናሳያቸው ጥሩ ነው እላለሁ just ምሳሌ የለም as example ብናደርገው ቆንጆ ነው ከዛ በተረፈ ሶሪ ማለት በጣም ጥሩ ነገር ነው እኔ በግራቸው ስር ወድቄ ነው ካጠፋሁኝ really ጥፋተኛ መሆኔን ካወኩኝ ተንበርክኬ ነው ይቅርታ የምጠይቃቸው ልጆቼ እና እንደገና ነው ብዙ ይቅርታ ልናዘጋጅ ይገባናል የለም በጣም ብዙ ይቅርታ ለልጆቻችን ልናዘጋጅ ይገባል መናደድ የለብንም ያበሽቁናል እናደዳለን ነገም ከነጎዲያም ሁሉ ጊዜም ግን ይቅርታ ልናደርግላቸው ይገባልና ልንወዳቸው ይገባል ይሄንን ላለው እንሳሳታለን በጣም ደግሞ ማወቅ የሚገባችሁ ሰዎች ነን really purposely ለመሳሳት ብለን አንሳሳትም አንዳንድ ጊዜ ግን እንሳሳታለን በጣም ካልቸር ማለት በጣም አስቀያሚ ነገር ነው ኋላ ይጎትታል በጣም የሚጎትተው really ወደ ኋላ ይስበናልና የማንፈልገውን ነገር እንድናደርግ ያደርገናል ትዝልሽ እንደሆነ አንድ ጊዜ እናቴ በጥፊ መትቼሻለሁ ትዝልሻል በጥፊ መታወሽ ትዝልሻል መትቼሻል አቅም ግን የዛን ጊዜ መታወሽ ለምንድን ነው የመታው በቃ just የሆነ ነገር አለ የሚጎትተን ነገር አለ በጣም የሚያናድድ ነገር ይጎትተናል ሰዎች መሆናችንን ማወቅ አለባችሁ ይቅርታ አድርጉልን ይቅርታ እናደርግላችኋለን ግን በጣም ነው የምንወዳችሁ ቀሽሞች ግን አይደለም ነው ወይንን ነው I love you guys that's it ጨርሻለሁ
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of this episode titled Holding Up the Other Half of the Sky, Habesha Fathers and Their Children. Next week, we'll conclude this podcast series. Join us for a reflective discussion with the team. See you then. The Kümneger Talks podcast has been brought to you by Selam, Abebe, Goitom, and Nassisse Solomon. Our theme music has been provided by the talented Lealem Abebe. Our sound design is the amazing Zeweldi, and all the artwork has been created by the lovely Dagmawit Worku.